All right, well, we all want to do a startup or are in some other entrepreneurial setting. And hands up everybody who is currently working on a startup or currently has a startup. Okay, so some folks for sure, other folks maybe just thinking about it. And by the way, this is also being captioned at the bottom, which will also be part of the recording. When you're doing a startup, though, you often have absolutely no data or very limited data on what your customers want. Who are your customers? How are you going to go to market? What is your competition? And you still have to make some decisions, right? You have to decide whether to go ahead and launch your company with what kind of product and in what kind of market. So how do you make those decisions when you know that the data that you have is limited? So a little bit about me before we dive into this. Again, my name is Christina Inge, and I am a consultant to the Brandeis University Innovation Center. I run ThoughtLight. We're a digital marketing and product launch agency headquartered in Boston in the financial district. And I've been working with entrepreneurial groups for several years now, probably over 15. And one of the most revolutionary ways of gathering data for a startup or any kind of new venture launch, whether it's a new product, a new event series at a university, a new nonprofit, it's customer discovery. Customer discovery is a method pioneered by Steve Blank, who's a professor at Stanford and a multi-time successful founder and entrepreneur. And what he developed was a method of interviewing potential customers to understand those customers' needs. You don't have to go out and conduct a survey, which can be very expensive. You don't have to go out there and pay for expensive analyst reports. What you want to do is go out and talk to potential customers and ask them about your product. But you're going to say to me, well, I've done that. I've tried that before when I've done a startup, and it's actually failed miserably because everyone told me that they wanted my product. They loved the idea, but then when it came to launch the product and actually start selling it, nobody bought. What gives? People told me they loved the product. Well, the key here is you're not going to ask people what your product is and whether they like it or not. Whether you're not going to show them a prototype. You're not going to ask them, would you buy a coffee mug with peacocks on it or a pair of blue blocker reading glasses? Because people will look at your product and they'll say, seems okay, this seems nice. Yeah, I can see better through these. Sure, I might buy it. But have you identified whether they actually need light blocking reading glasses? How many people actually need reading glasses out there? And how much better is your product than the dollar store reading glasses that they already have? If you show them the product and say, hey, would you like this product? Most people don't want to hurt your feelings. They're going to say, of course, yes, seems like a great idea. So what you want to do is get people, as Rob Fitzpatrick, the author of The Mom Test, another great book on customer discovery, says, stop lying to you. They're not lying to you intentionally. They're kindly not hurting your feelings. So I do really strongly recommend The Mom Test for this method of data gathering. It's an excellent book, really good audio book as well. But there's a much shorter free resource online. These are the questions developed by Michael Fishbein. It's a list of questions. It's going to be included with this slide deck, so it's going to go out to all of you. You can also simply search Michael Fishbein Customer Discovery, and I'll also put it into the chat. And this list of questions focuses on understanding what would help your customer solve a specific problem. So I want to ask everybody, what is the problem that I'm solving right now? Well, I guess I'll have to answer my question rhetorically. Not being able to see my screen is the problem that I'm solving right now. There's tons of different ways you can solve this problem. You could push the screen further away if you're farsighted. You could increase the font size on your screen. You could go get LASIK surgery. There's a ton of different ways of solving the problem. You want to determine that your method of solving the problem is what people are willing to pay for. So what you want to do is gather data over your problem's scope. rather than product demand. If you show people these glasses, they'll tell you, sure, I will buy them. What you instead want to do is gather data on the size of the problem. How extensive is it, and how well is it being solved right now? The best products start with the problem. Glasses started with the problem of, I can't see all that well. Ring lights started with the problem of, my Zoom meeting is poorly lit, or my influencer videos are poorly lit. Every product that is selling well right now typically started with a problem. There's a common misperception that you can create demand where absolutely no demand exists. An example might be, say, the pet rock. Or for instance, did we ever know before influencers told us that we needed highlighter powder because we just don't look shiny enough naturally? We need to put powder on our faces to look shinier. So people will cite products like this as created demand. More seriously, they'll cite things like the first smartphones as created demand. However, that's a myth, because all of these products actually solve documentable problems that had extensive scope even before the product came along. I remember what life was like before smartphones. If you were away from your office, you couldn't tell whether a message had gotten to you or not. You had to have your laptop with you. And before laptops were invented, you had to actually go back to your computer. And before computers were invented, you actually had a phone wired into your wall, and you got mail once or twice a day. That made communication much slower, and it was a source of continuous frustration. I remember buying my first smartphone precisely because I was a consultant at the time, and it was really eating into my ability to serve my clients, that if one client needed something in the middle of the day that I could start working on or thinking about while I was in transit, I had no idea that that was even happening and that there was work that could be done because I didn't have my laptop with me, or there was no Wi-Fi. So smartphones solved a real problem. You would argue that perhaps even highlighter solves a real problem, because in this age of Zoom, you don't want to look poorly lit, and therefore this product makes you look well lit even when the lighting is not good in your environment, or so on and so forth. So for every product that looks like it was created demand, the demand actually existed. So before we jump into the data collection methods that I'm going to break down for you tonight, remember one thing. Your job is not to convince people to buy a product they don't know they need. It's to convince people that your product is the solution to a problem that keeps them up at night. I was kept up at night with the pace at which I was able to know things I needed for my business before smartphones came along. It doesn't keep me up at night, but it is absolutely frustrating that over the age of 40, I would need really long arms longer than Michael Phelps's, to be able to see anything. This solves that problem. The ring light solves the poor lighting problem. So this is a problem people know they have, that you're trying to gather the data on. How are you going to do this? You're going to start interviewing people. Now, here at Brandeis, we work with the National Science Foundation I-Corps program. And if you're affiliated with Brandeis, I strongly recommend that you go to our website, brandeis.edu/innovation, and check out how you can become an I-Corps fellow and apply for the program. In that program, which again is funded by the National Science Foundation and has a national competition that's run by the National Science Foundation, in addition to the ones that are run regionally by us at universities, they require that you interview 100 people in your target audience. That's a reasonable number of people from whom you can gather data to find out whether the problem you're solving really exists. For instance, your room gets dark and your ring light saves the day. Now, it can be unrealistic to get 100 interviews, but if you are actually, trying to launch a venture for which you are going to seek funding, that I would argue is, if not the bare minimum, a strongly recommended number. Now, in the class I teach that integrates the business model canvas, and hello to those folks who are here from that class, Usually I say you want maybe 10 to 15 because it is a short class just designed to give you the tools to then implement the business model canvas. But if you're doing a startup, you actually want to make a business out of what you're doing, aim for 50 to 100 folks who are in your target audience. Now, what are you going to do when you identify those folks in your target audience? Well, it's all about gathering qualitative data. You can certainly gather quantitative data. For instance, if you want to know what is the size of the makeup industry in the United States or in whatever country you're dialing in from tonight or aiming to market your product in, there's usually analyst reports that are available for free as content marketing from vendors. There are studies from the US Department of Commerce and other governmental and non-governmental entities that will tell you the size of the specific market. And you want to find that data. You want that data because if you go and pitch investors, they'll want to know what the size of your total addressable market is. And as a follow-up to this session, I will send a list of my favorite US sources and a few global sources for free governmental data conducted, again, usually by Department of Commerce or the Department of Education or the Bureau of Labor Statistics that will tell you the size of a total market. But that's only going to tell you that there's people out there in your target audience. The data that you want to gather is data on how many people, what the size of the problem is out there. And if folks could be so kind as to mute themselves, it would be much appreciated. Thank you. So these are some of the questions that Michael Fishbein, again, it's a free resource, not perhaps as extensive as the MOM test, but one that you'll certainly be able to avail yourself of, and I will be sending out the link. These are some of the questions that he recommends you ask to validate what problems your consumers actually have. One question is, what's the hardest part of your day? For instance, if you're selling reading glasses, I might, and so might a lot of people say, well, one of the hardest parts of my day is I can't see my screen without my reading glasses, so I need one in every room of my home or my office where I do work. What unmet needs do you have? Again, you're not asking for the story of somebody's life. You're trying to gather qualitative data on the problem they have that you can solve with your product. So you could say, what are the unmet needs that you have for makeup? What are the unmet needs you have for vision? What are the unmet needs you have for accounting software or for auto repair shop management platforms? Whatever it is you're selling, ask what the unmet needs are of the customer. Don't tell them what needs you're going to meet. Don't tell them what product you have that might meet their needs. Don't say, hey, if I had software for your automotive repair shop that made it easier to order parts, would you want that? Because people will just say yes, but they may not actually have ordering parts as a big problem throughout the day. If you ask somebody, on the other hand, what are the unmet needs that you have? The first thing that's going to come to mind is the unmet need that they experienced most recently or most urgently. That's going to be the real data. Again, you don't need a lot of it. Right now you have zero data, but every time someone answers these questions for you or any of the others that Michael Fishbein puts forth, you have another piece of real valuable data. Another question you could ask is simply saying, what product do you wish you had that doesn't exist yet? Some people may be imaginative enough to answer that question. Some people might say, I don't know at first, but then eventually they will come around with an answer saying, I wish there were some way to check my messages when I'm not at my computer. Nobody ever told Steve Jobs that I wish there were such a thing as a smartphone. They wanted a way to check their messages when they were away from their computer. And in fact, the smartphone was not the first example of that. If you remember the Palm Pilots, the Blackberries and the Trios, or the Palm Trio, that was how you could check your messages when you weren't at your desk. They were kind of clunky and difficult to use. So once that product came along, people might have said, I wish that there were an easier to use Trio. Henry Ford famously said, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. Now, I hate to quote Henry Ford, and those of you who know me know I always say that whenever I'm forced to quote Henry Ford, because he was a terrible person, but he's also actually wrong about this. Because if you ask people what they want and they say a faster horse, the operative part of that sentence is faster. They want to get places faster. Now, you might offer them something that is not a horse. They offered them the Model T, but their problem was that they had an unmet need to get places faster. Follow-up question that Henry Ford or anybody else inventing automobiles at the time would have asked is, what tasks take up the most time in your day? And frankly, before the invention of the automobile, the task that took up the most time in a lot of people's day was getting from one place to another. A lot of people couldn't even afford a horse, they had to walk. What could be done to improve your experience with this process or role? This is an especially good question if you're in B2B. Because if you're in B2B, whether you're selling to auto repair shops or chip manufacturers, they already have an existing process in place. And you can bet that they have problems with it, because everybody always has problems with things. Nothing in the world is perfect. And so you want to elicit, what is the biggest problem that they have? What is the thing that gives them the hardest time with their existing processes right now? They can ask this question in B2C as well, but it's a particularly good question to ask in the B2B environment. You might want to ask a little bit gentler or more open-ended question as well, which could be something like, what is the hardest part about being a accountant or a administrative assistant at an automotive shop, or whatever it is that you're interviewing people about, because that's going to also address the unmet needs. So I'm not going to go into all of these questions. Again, there's many, many more on Michael Fishbein's website. I urge you to check it out. But I want you to take away from this the fact that in order to gather useful data in a brand new greenfield environment where you don't have any data at all, is not to ask people closed-ended questions and not to ask them product questions, but ask them open-ended questions that get to the heart of what is truly their problem. The next thing, though, is, well, now that I know how to interview people, whom do I interview? Well, I would recommend, and so does Steve Blank, and so do so many other startup authors, it's a tried and true method. You don't want to just interview your end user. So if your target audience is the coordinator or administrative head at an automotive shop, you're not just going to interview her or him or them. You're also going to interview people who are removed from the problem, such as the decision maker and the beneficiaries. Now, in an automotive shop environment, for instance, the decision maker would probably be the owner because it's a small business. They might rely on their administrative professional's recommendation, but at the end of the day, the owner is the one signing the check. So you want to talk to them as well. Beneficiaries are people in the organization or in the context in which your product is going to be used to also benefit from the existence of your product. In the case of the automotive shop, the beneficiaries would be the mechanics, the customers, and anybody else for whom getting the parts quickly, efficiently, and the correct parts on time is absolutely critical. Now, within your end users, you're going to at first count yourself lucky if you get any end users at all. But I want you to be picky. I want you to make sure that you're interviewing people in the three main categories of end user. The power or advanced user. This is the person who's already an expert at using your type of product. So in the case of, for instance, the makeup industry, it would be the makeup artist or the beauty influencer online. You then want to also interview the average user. That would be somebody who wears makeup every day, but has absolutely no artistic background or hasn't got a cosmetology license. They're just an average user. And the casual user would be maybe someone who only wears makeup on special occasions, not for every single Zoom meeting. So that would be the way you would break it down. Now, you might have a hard time within the same organization finding all three types of users. If you go into the automotive shop, they may all say, well, Gladys is the only person who orders parts. However, if you stick around and embed yourself within the organization, spend a day or two with them, you might find that although Gladys is the one ordering the parts 80% of the time, sometimes the mechanics order parts. Sometimes the salespeople order parts. They may be casual users, but they absolutely exist. The other thing you want to do is maybe you have to go from organization to organization. You may only have one type of end user, maximum two within one organization, and you can certainly talk to the decision makers, and you should also talk to the beneficiaries. But maybe Gladys is extremely experienced. She is a power user. You have casual users in the form of the mechanics, but nobody else within the entire organization. You couldn't find an average user at that particular shop. What you have to do, go to another shop. That's why you end up interviewing 50, 100 different organizations and people, because not every organization is going to yield all of these different stakeholders, but you must talk to all of them, because what the average user needs is very different from what power users needs or a casual user's needs. Now, Steve Blank talks about early evangelists, and these are people who have a need for your product so severe that they've already created their own solution. So this could be the auto shop administrative assistant who is creating her own parts ordering system, coded it herself or something like that, because nothing out there exists. Or she's using Excel and email and some kind of patched together system. That person could be an average user or a power user. You notice there's a gap here between the average and the casual. They're almost never a casual user. The early evangelist, the person who really cares about and becomes invested in your product, is going to be either a power or an advanced user. But typically speaking, you also want to speak to the casual user because they may have a real impact on the decision-making process. So make sure you talk to all types of users in your customer discovery process and follow those fishbone questions. Nonetheless, you're still at best going to talk to 100 people. If your total addressable market is 5 million people, 100 people are probably not representative of the entire market. So you still have some challenges with limited data, even with customer discovery. And here are the 4 big ones and how to overcome them. The 4 big challenges when you've only got a sample size of 100, even if you did in-depth qualitative interviews, and you have quantitative data on the side from, say, the Department of Commerce that is supporting your total addressable market data, is that you've still got that small sample. So you've got sampling errors, the difficulty of telling apart signal and noise, power dynamics, and gut check interpretation. And we'll break all 4 of these down. So challenge number 1 is sampling errors. If I talk to 100 people who work at auto shops, who sometimes use the parts ordering software, and there's 3 million people in the United States and Canada alone who work for auto shops and order parts, how do I know those 100 people are an accurate sample of my target audience? Excuse me. Well, you don't after the fact. So what you want to do is make sure you're interviewing the right people before the fact. It's too late to solve the problem after the fact unless you go out and interview more people, but then you'll just reproduce the problem unless you have a proper qualifying process. A qualifying process is a market research methodology that allows you to determine whether people are an appropriate sample for your type of research. If you've ever taken a survey, you've probably been subjected to qualifying questions. For instance, you might be asked how often you shop for new cars or makeup or glasses or notebooks. That was a qualifying question. Whoever was conducting the survey probably only wanted to talk to either frequent or casual or power users. So they wanted to know who you were. Make sure that you have developed a set of questions, not just for customer discovery, but before you even ask those questions, you want to ask another set of questions, your qualifying questions. Those are going to determine whether someone is a power, an average, or a casual user, what type of other stakeholder they might be, And also, if you have aspects of your addressable market where it's important to get a sample from each one. For instance, you need to talk to people who are both at independent shops, but also at dealerships. You want to make sure that you're getting a good mix. So for instance, if you find that half the shops in North America are dealerships, so across the US, Mexico, and Canada, you want to make sure that half the people you interview are at dealerships. So make sure that you're asking people qualifying questions and test those questions to make sure that they're actually getting you the sample that you want. So why is it hopping to challenge 3? I don't know. Oh, hang on a second. Minor technical glitch here. So challenge number 2 is telling apart signal versus noise. I don't have a slide about that because I actually have a question for all of you about that. So let's say I spoke to 100 people who all work for auto shops, and equal numbers of people told me that ordering parts is a problem, ordering parts is a minor problem, not a problem at all, or literally it's driving them out of business. Each segment is exactly 25 people. I have no consensus. What am I going to do? What would I do if I had absolutely no consensus? Well, it looks like you don't have an answer to that either. So in the interest of time, I will move along. So when you have an issue with telling apart signal from noise, oh, something's coming through in the chat. Talk to more people. Exactly. Interview more people. That's exactly what you want to do. So if you have a problem where you can't tell whether something is relevant data or not because you don't see clear patterns, that's actually not an independent problem. It is actually resulting most of the time from problems 1, problems 3, or problem 4. Signal to noise is never its own problem. It's one of the other 3. Either your sample size was too small or too skewed to get the data you want, or you have one of the other 2 problems. So what are the other 2 problems? Well, one is, again, the third problem is power dynamics. Power dynamics are when you get a group of people together, you interview all of them, and the most powerful person, who may be the person with the most important title, but they also might be the person with the most influence, the person who's most trusted, skews the entire conversation. So if you go into the shop and the person who does 80% of the ordering is Gladys, Gladys is seen as the person who has the expertise in the matter of ordering parts. And she says, it's not that big of a deal if you have a problem ordering parts. Everyone else is going to sort of nod and say, well, if she says it's not that big of a deal, then I guess it's not that big of a deal. Maybe I just don't know how to use the current software. So expertise, formal power, or simply somebody being more articulate or more vocal in a group is going to skew people towards their opinion. So in order to correct for the power dynamics, you're going to want to do 2 things. One is you want to separate your participants. Don't have everybody in a room with Gladys asking about things in which Gladys is seen to be the expert, because they're going to go along with what she says. Don't have everybody in a room with the boss asking about whether this software works or not, because if people are afraid to tell their boss this expensive software doesn't really work, you may not get an honest answer. Separate your participants. But even then, in a face-to-face interview, the power dynamic between you and the interviewee might be off. Some people are nervous to talk to strangers. They may see you as an authority. Or on the flip side, they may see you as someone with no authority and not give you robust enough answers because they don't see you as a valuable use of their time. So you're not going to just do these face-to-face interviews. If that's all you can get people to give you the time for, it's better than nothing. But the better thing to do is work alongside them individually. If they're ordering auto parts, you're going to sit next to them, you're going to watch them order the auto parts and walk you through the steps. This is a method that I borrow from user experience design, and that Steve Blank borrows from user experience design. And again, it's a proven method in the startup world. Sit next to people and have them walk you through how they use a product or a tool or a service, because that's going to give you an honest answer, and they're going to focus on the tool rather than on you. It's going to reduce the human dynamic to the right level. Doesn't mean the human touch isn't going to be there, but the dynamic between you and your subjects, or the subjects and each other, is not going to be, the biggest part of the interaction. And then finally, problem number 4 that's going to make it hard for you to interpret your data when it's limited is what I call gut check interpretation. That's when you look at the data and let's say 60% of people seem to say X and 40% of people seem to say Y, and you really wanted the answer to be X. Ordering parts is a big giant problem. And so you say, well, it looks like the data says that I'm correct and there is a market for my product. We all want to see in the data what we were hoping to see. Now, this is the challenge when you're dealing with qualitative data versus quantitative. Quantitative data is numbers-based data. It's surveys where people have multiple choice questions. It's data on how many sales exist within, say, the makeup or the automotive industry, what the size of the industry is, how many organizations there are. It's just hard numbers. Qualitative data is the kind of data you're collecting when you do customer discovery, like we're talking about tonight. That's when you get people's words, their body language, their impressions. You want to try to turn that qualitative data into quantitative, and it can be done. There's actually a method that's used widely in the social sciences, and it's called coding. What you do is you take the transcripts of all of the conversations that you have had and you give them to somebody who was not involved in the data collection. You hire interns, you get somebody on your team who has no stake in what the answers are, and you give them the transcripts. And what they're going to do is they're going to give it a read through first, maybe not even all of it, maybe just the top 20%, and they're going to identify patterns. For instance, of this 20%, 10 people mentioned parts being out of stock, but the system saying that they're in stock. 5 people said that you didn't have accurate shipping cost data. And so each one of these themes that you see on the first read through is given a number. You give it, let's say shipping cost data is called number 1. Knowing whether things are in stock or not is called number 2. And then you read through every single transcript systematically. And again, it's better to give this to somebody who has no involvement in the rest of the project. And every time they see somebody mention one of the themes, they just mark it on the document. And again, they could be doing it on paper, they could be doing it on the screen, and they tally up how many times theme 1 appeared, theme 2, or theme 3. Now you've turned that qualitative data into quantitative, and you know exactly how many times people complained about items not being in stock, but the system showing that it was. Now you're not relying on your gut check. As long as you're just reading transcripts, or you're going around with a notebook and you go back to your office or your home with the notebook, you're still just interpreting the data on a gut check. You want to be systematic. Coding is the standard in most of the social science fields. If you're doing publishable research in social sciences, you're expected to code your interviews. You can't just say, we talked to 20 students and 5 of them sounded kind of happy. You want to actually count up the specific themes. So take this scientific method, apply it to your interviews, and you're going to have a lot stronger understanding of your data. So I hope that you enjoyed this talk. Again, just to really quickly remind you, this is my contact information. I'm very open to questions, but I know that I've left some time for questions, but a quick review. If you've got limited data, you're going to have four major problems with it: sampling error, telling apart signal versus noise, power dynamics, and gut check interpretation. Telling apart signal from noise stems from the other three problems. You can correct sampling errors with better qualification and larger samples if you have it, as some of the folks in the discussion mentioned. With power dynamics, you can borrow from the user experience data field and use standard user experience research methods like sitting next to people and getting them to walk you through your methods, their method of using the product or service. If you're interested in more UX techniques, and a lot of them are good for gathering qualitative data, there's a really wonderful organization called the Interactive Design Foundation. They have online courses on user experience research, and for $80 a year, you can take as many of the courses as you want. They'll teach you in an asynchronous manner exactly how to do this kind of user experience research, which also really helps with customer discovery. And then finally, one of the biggest problems is gut check interpretation, a problem that can readily be solved by borrowing from the social sciences and using coding. And there are actually a couple of really good scholarly works on how to code your data, maybe a little bit more than you want to do as you're building out your startup, but there's a couple of articles on it as well that I'm going to share when these slides in this recording are shared with you. So take a look at all of those resources. And again, I hope that this has helped you figure out how to not only generate the data that you need to do your startup the right way, but also interpret that data in a way that's going to give you confidence, give your team confidence, and give potential investors confidence that there's a real market out there for your product or service. That's all I have. Over to you for questions. All right, any questions? Okay, here they are coming through in the chat. Can you give some tips on measuring competition? Great question coming in from Ada. Absolutely. There's a couple of really good competitive analysis tools out there. I'm actually going to post some of these right now into the chat. One of them is called Owler. It just recently got bought by a company called Meltwater, which is a PR and communications company. Also, some social media management is embedded in their tool. That's going to help you dig up information about any of your competitors. Also, again, the US Department of Commerce, if you're US based or trying to market in the US, is going to tell you how your industry breaks down into subgroups, and that can be very useful as well. I also like LinkedIn. So if you want to know, for instance, how many other people are making automotive management software, you can go on LinkedIn and look to see who else is making that kind of software. There's also a tool called SimilarWeb that gets you a little bit more into the weeds, and that's going to tell you, for instance, if you know the names of your competitors, how do you know how much web traffic they get, where they're regionally strong in terms of what regions they're getting their web traffic from, what demographics they're strong with. And again, it's not the cheapest tool in the world. There are free trials. It costs thousands and thousands of dollars, but just get a free trial and do all of your research that way. Curious where competition comes into the picture. Julie, can you expand on your question as I put some of the resources into the chat?
Actually, I think Aida's question was the same as mine. We hit send at the same time.
Absolutely. And not to give a plug to my book, but I have a book coming out on marketing analytics. It has a whole chapter on how to do competitive analysis. For folks who attended this event, I will try to send you that chapter for free because I'm not trying to sell you my book. get my publisher's permission. I'll try to send you that for free. But again, Owler is a good one, SimilarWeb. And if you don't know the names of your competitors, Googling for them or searching for them on LinkedIn is really good. One of the things you might also find is industry trade publications. There is not an industry in the world that doesn't have a trade publication. Whether it's forklifts, whether it's warehousing materials, there are several different trade publications. Something I've been doing since before there were smartphones is you go on those trade publications websites, or back in the day, their print version, and look at all of the advertisers. Get a list of all the advertisers, and that's your biggest competition. They're at least the people with the money to advertise. And then read all of the articles in there, especially product reviews and the press releases that are posted to those websites, and that's going to give you your smaller competitors. So find the name of your industry trade publication. In fact, I would argue that if you're not already reading trade publications in the industry that you're marketing to, you might be too distant from the industry to be able to develop a good product for it. You really want to be knowledgeable about an industry before you launch into it. So if you're ready to launch a product, you already know what those publications are, but now read them with a competitive eye. See who those competitors are. So I just posted the link to the Interaction Design Foundation. Ooh, Ming Yi, thank you for the question. So Ming Yi is a professor of market research at Northeastern and asked a really phenomenal question. How do you check intercode reliability? I think that is a really, really good question. Typically speaking, what you can do is have multiple different people review your codes before you start any kind of coding. So get several people to review the codes and say that this makes sense. Now, obviously, if you were doing academic research, you and I know you would have to first validate the instrument. I'm going to say I don't know of any VCs or angels who want you to do something that aggressive. But you can look up, and I can actually put some resources into the chat that will tell you how to validate an instrument. There's ways like you would test a small sample, you would then see whether that has predictive value. So you might need to know a little bit of statistics. That would be one way you could validate an instrument. Now, in terms of coding qualitative data, DelfTool is a pretty accessible tool. It's relatively easy. And again, they have a free trial. I'm a really big believer in free trials. So DelfTool has a pretty good one as well. I want to share with you a couple of other links of tools that are available. Actually, Qualtrics, if you're affiliated with a university, you should be able to get a free Qualtrics account. So you might want to take a look at that as well. Also, aggressively advertising right now, but I do want to say I have never tried out Weavio, but it basically says they're a semantic search engine, and so they'll do some of your coding for you, kind of a, not exactly AI, but sort of AI. But yeah, I don't know if I trust it. I haven't tried it out, so make your own decision. Fern, great question from Fern. So many of the startups we get here at Brandeis through the Spark program prefer to conduct customer discovery via social media surveys. Can you summarize the pluses and minuses of that type of survey? Great question, Fern. So yeah, absolutely, Ming-Yi, although I think your expertise in this is probably far greater than mine. So please feel free to weigh in the chat if you're so inclined. Would be most grateful. I would say it's definitely not considered, strictly speaking, proper customer discovery. Steve Blank is absolutely adamant in his book, like 4 Steps to Epiphany, that you need to talk to people and that surveys don't cut it. One of the reasons why surveys don't cut it is people will do it thoughtlessly, but more importantly, you can't dig deeper. So if you ask people a question like how big a problem is not having reading glasses in every room, and you ask them to rate it on, let's say, a rating scale of 1 to 10, what's called a Likert scale, you can't ask them, why did you say 8? Maybe you can ask one follow-up question and maybe they'll type in a little bit of an answer, but if that answer is ambiguous, you can't keep poking at the answer till you get the real data. So that's the real downside, is that it's not considered true customer discovery, because although it gives you data, it doesn't really allow you to do the problem discovery. It allows you to get some quick questions answered. So for instance, if you wanted to ask people who run automotive shops, what's your budget for software? You can do a survey for that, because that's something that has a simple and unambiguous answer. You can get that answer and you can move on. But if the data that you want to gather is, well, tell me more. Why do you think it's not that big of a problem? You're not going to be able to collect that off of a survey. The advantage of surveys is that they'll help you reach people who would not be willing to sit down with you for an interview, or it'll help you gather some quick data and it'll give you that quantitative data that is more definite in the eyes of some people, because it's, again, not soft conversational data, but it's hard numbers. But again, it's not really considered true customer discovery, but it can have its advantages. But to follow up on that answer, if the reason you're giving a survey out versus talking to people is because they'd say that they don't have time to talk to you, that in and of itself is a form of customer discovery. Because if you say, I want to talk to you about your problems with ordering parts, and you make it clear that you're a student, you're not a salesperson, you really want to know about the problems with ordering parts, and people don't want to talk to you, they may not really be worried about ordering parts. So again, silence means people may not consider the problem to be worth their time. Doesn't necessarily mean that, but it is very telling if no one wants to talk to you. Question from Ada: how do you get strangers to agree to letting you sit next to them, walking through their process? Interviewees tend to be need to be cultivated too, right? Absolutely. Typically speaking, it is a follow-on to an interview. That's often the easiest way. So if somebody gets really excited in the interview, you can certainly interview people and then tell them about your product. That's often the way it flows. You interview them, you don't tell them about your product. You get the problem validated. Then at the end of the interview, you can certainly show them your prototype or tell them about the product and ask them what they think. If they get excited, they might be all the more willing to then sit down with you and let you go through their process with them. So yes, there's a huge trust factor. It's all about relationships. Again, goes back to the topic of knowing your trade publications in your industry. If you don't right now know 5 people who will sit down and talk to you about their makeup problems, their lighting problems, or their automotive parts problems, then you don't know enough people who order automotive parts or wear makeup to make a product for them. If you don't know 5 people in your target audience, then that target audience is one that you are not yet ready to cater to. Because if you are part of that target audience, you are a makeup wearer, you are a person who orders automotive parts for an auto shop, then you would know 5 of your fellows. So that's very telling. I always tell people, don't start a company in an industry you don't know nothing about. It's going to fail. If you have never worn makeup, don't make makeup. If you've never worked in an auto shop, do not make software for auto shops. I'm not going to name names, but in the course of my career, I have been a director or VP for several different startups, and I have been a judge and a mentor at Mass Challenge and for several other startup competitions. And I have never, ever seen a startup succeed in a market they did not understand intimately. Doesn't mean that everybody on your team has to be part of that market. You can have a mix of people. In fact, as Rebecca will tell you, you want diversity of opinions and experiences and perspectives in order to form a strong team. But the strength of your team has to also include industry expertise. So start with the 5 people you know, or the 10 people you know. And if your product has interest for them, they'll introduce you to the next 5, and those people will introduce you to the next 5. If that's not happening, if it's like pulling teeth to get anyone to talk to you, if you don't know anybody in the industry, go back to the drawing board, make a product for yourself and the people you know, And then make sure it's something that they're excited enough about that they're willing to talk to you. And when you get to that point, that's when you're in your sweet spot and you have the right product. All right, any other questions?
Hey, Christina, can you give an example of one of your most frustrating times of trying to do this data collection and analysis, and what were the hurdles that you had to overcome?
Fantastic question, Rebecca. I would say some of the most frustrating times that I've had with customer discovery was actually when I founded my company ThoughtLight, and it was entirely my fault. It was before I was good at customer discovery. And so people came to me for years saying that, you know, you're so good at teaching marketing, I really would pay you to teach me marketing. And I got some consulting gigs doing that. And obviously now I am a professor of marketing also, but I thought that there was a market for a training program that companies would pay for their employees, such that it would be different than the 10 others that already existed, like marketing profs. And I would talk to people, and unfortunately I got to the product question too soon. I would first ask what their problems were, like, what are you struggling to learn? And they'd say SEO or email. And I'd be thinking, oh, well, that's great. That's what I can teach you. And then I'd say, well, would you take these classes? And people would say, yes, absolutely. And then what happened is that people would take the classes, and then after like 2 or 3 classes or a day-long workshop, they would realize that digital marketing is just so difficult. And Sarah, I'm sure you can weigh in on this as well, that you can't learn it in a reasonable amount of time if you're an accountant or a doctor or you sell plumbing fixtures for a living. And so they would just say, hey, I want to pay you to do it. I now know I can't do this. And so the thing is that I misidentified who my market was. I thought it was the small business person who's not a marketer, who wanted to learn just enough marketing to do it themselves. What actually ended up happening is the small business person realized that they didn't want to do it themselves after all. And so what I did is I actually pivoted. And if I had it to do over again, what I would do is I would go back to the drawing board, and as Feras mentioned, I would then interview more marketers. After the first year, though, I didn't have a lot of runway. I had to bootstrap, and so I had to quickly pivot in a direction that would generate cash. If I had been able to have more runway, like if I had been willing to get investors, I would have gone back and done more customer discovery with marketers, who are the only people who really want to do SEO and email marketing in depth, not the small business people. Unfortunately, I needed to pay myself and make payroll. And so we pivoted in the direction that people were willing to pay us for. I'm not saying that I wouldn't eventually go ahead and launch a product again, knowing now what I know. So honestly, the problem that I had was I misidentified my market. I spent too much time trying to solve that market's problems and ran out of the runway to pivot to another market. And I think a lot of people run out of runway. And so the moral of the story, and I know we're almost at time, and so thanks for asking that question, is there's a saying in writing, and it's a pretty upsetting saying maybe, so trigger warning, it's called kill your darlings, which means if you've written a really good paragraph or you particularly care about a character, get rid of them because no one else is going to like it as much. If you're really in love with an idea, you're blind to its faults. So if you're starting to get early data that says this is a bad idea and you're reluctant to let it go and you're holding on to it for dear life, trying to get another answer that says it's a good idea, it's already too late. Let it go. Let go early. Pivot early. There's no shame in that. The problem is people don't do that. And so that's the moral of the story and what I want you to take away from this lesson.
Before everybody leaves, if you could please fill out the survey. I put the link in the chat. It would really help us out. Thank you, guys.
Yes, thank you. Please do fill out the survey. And again, this session was recorded. You're going to get a copy of the recording. You're going to get a copy of the resources, not just the ones in the chat, but a couple of additional ones. We all highly recommend the mom test. So I'll send you some links to some of these book titles. And I'll see a couple of you in a couple of minutes. I'll see some of you tomorrow. I'll see some of you around campus. And for the folks I won't see in any of these contexts, have a great night and best of luck. I'm always available. Feel free to send me an email. Happy to talk to any entrepreneur.
Thank you.
Take
Thank you for
care.
joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Christina.
Thank you.